Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi shir.
Shalom and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Brachos Daf Lamed Hey. Says the Mishnah, Keitzad mevarchen ala peris. How is one meant to make a bracha on fruit? In what manner does one bless Hashem for fruit? Says Taisus, what do you mean Keitzad? How does one make a bracha? How do we even know this concept of making a bracha? Says Taisus, it's a svara, it's logic, it's common sense. As the Gemara will conclude later, it is a svara that one must acknowledge and thank Hashem prior to deriving hana, benefit, physical pleasure from this world. And this is the basis for the opening question of the Mishnah. Okay, so how is one meant to go about making bracha? It says the Mishnah, Al peres ilan, a fruit coming from a tree, hu omer beirei pri'es. Hashem creates the fruit from a tree, chutz min hayayin, except for wine. Shal hayayin hu omer beirei pri'a gefen. On wine, since it is more chashiv, says Rashi, on account of its special significance, therefore the Chachamim establish a separate bracha for wine, even though it too grows on a tree, comes from the grapes which grow on the vine. Nevertheless, the Chachamim establish a separate bracha of beirei pri, the fruit of a gefen, of a vine. Val peretz aretz, on fruit coming from the earth. Hashem creates the fruit from the earth. Chutz ben apas, except for bread. Again, since it is a significant food, a chashav food, al apasu omer hamitzi lechem and aretz. That has a separate bracha. Hamitzi lechem and aretz. Hashem who brings forth the bread from the aretz, from the earth. The Mefarshim point out that in the bracha of hamitzi lechem and aretz we find 10 words, and those 10 words correspond to keneged the 10 malachos of pas, the 10 stages of development that are required to bring the bread to its completion. Planting, harvesting, threshing, etc., until it becomes a finished product, and that's why we have 10 letters, 10 words in Hamitzi Lechem and Aretz. Continues the Mishnah about Yerakos on greens. Huaymer Bayer Pri Adama. Hashem creates the fruit of the earth. Rabbi Yehuda Aymer Bayer Mina Deshaim. Rabbi Yehuda holds that one must be more specific when he makes a bracha, since from the earth come forth many different types of produce. We have the fruit of the earth, like melons, radishes. We have deshaim, we have herbage, greens, like lettuce, cabbage. And we have finally zraim, seeds, for instance, beans. So these are 3 different categories. Although they all emanate from the earth, nevertheless we must be more specific in our bracha. When we are making a bracha on zraim, on seeds, we make bari minei zraim. Hashem created the species of seeds. When it is pri adama, melons, radishes, then you make bari pri adama. However, when it is deshaim, greens, herbage, then you are meant to say bari minei. Hashem creates the species of deshaim, of herbage. Continues the Gemara, Mananamili. Where is obligation? The chiv to make a bracha, where is this sourced? How do we know that? The Tanur Rabbanon, Kodesh Hilulim Hashem. The pasuk is speaking about Netar Ravai, the 4th year of the fruit. We know that the first 3 years of a fruit tree are considered to be erla. It's forbidden to be eaten. However, the 4th year, that is considered Netar Ravai, something which grows on the 4th year, Ravai Ravi. That has a din, halacha similar to Ma'aseh Sheni, where the fruit must be brought up to Yerushalayim and eaten in a manner similar to Ma'aseh Sheni, the fruit itself or its value. You may redeem the fruit with money and bring the money up and buy with it fruit in Yerushalayim. So that is Netar Ravai. Says the Gemara, the pasuk refers to Netar Ravai as Kodesh Hilulim Lashem. It is sanctified Hilulim with praises. Hilulim is a plural term, double praise, Lashem, to Hashem. So we learn from here, Melamed, this teaches us Shetunim Bracha. It requires, food requires a bracha, lefneihem ulachreim, prior to eating and after eating. Mekan Amar Rabbi Akiva. From here, Rabbi Akiva derives that asala adam sheyitim kulum. A person may not taste anything, any food, kodim sheyivarech, prior to making a bracha. So this is the source for a bracha on food. Says the Gemara, how could that be so? V'hai kodesh helulam la'achidu asa. Is this pasuk referring to the requirement of making a bracha? We need this pasuk for something else. We have a double hilul, twice praising. Chad, one is to teach us, the Amar Rachmana, Hachle, V'odar Achle. One Hillel is meant to teach us the requirement to redeem, to be Mechalel, the Neter Ravai. Now, how do we learn from Hillel? How do we learn Chilul from there? The Mepharshim say that the Hey and the Ches are interchangeable, they look very alike, and they emanate from the same source in the person's throat. They both are Oisies, Groinios. So we find that the Chazal will expound by interchanging the Hey with the Ches. So here too, one Hillel refers to Chilul, redeeming. We must be Achli, we must redeem the Neter Ravai, V'hadar Achli, and then you can eat it. So one is meant for that. If you the second Hillel, meaning the double expression of Hillel, the second praise, is meant to teach you something else regarding Neter Ravai as well. Davar haton shira ton Chilul. It's meant to teach us that the halach of Neter Ravai only applies to fruit from a vine, to grapes. How do we see that from the word Hillel? Because grapes and the produce from grapes, wine, is something which brings about shira, song of the Levium during the Karbanos and the Beis Hamikdash. So the pasuk is telling you only something which brings about shira in the Beis Hamikdash that has the halachas, that contains the halachas of Neter Ravai. So that's why we need the second Hillel, V'idach. The second Hillel is to teach you davar haton shira ton chilul, only something which requires shira, meaning that the shira of the Levim on the Karban is recited upon the pouring of the wine, of the Nesachim on the Mizbeach at the time of a Karban. That is Toin Chil, that contains the halacha of redemption of Neter Ravai. V'she'ena Toin Shira, however, everything else, all the fruit that don't require Shira, they don't bring about the concept of singing, of song during the Karban in the Beis HaMikdash. Ein Toin Chil, they do not contain, they don't possess these halachas of Neter Ravai. On the fourth year, you may eat them anywhere, you don't need to bring it to Yerushalayim, they don't require redemption. This is in accordance with Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani, the name of Rav Yonasan. The Amar, Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rav Yonasan. Minayin, shein oymen shira ela al yain. How do we know that shira, during the Karban, the Levium sing shira on the Mizbeach, by the Mizbeach, is only done al yain, upon the pouring, the mark of the yain, on the Mizbeach shenemar, v'atoymer lehem hagefen. The vine proclaimed to them and said, "Echadalti es tiroshi, will I cease to produce my juice, my wine? I'm a sameach elokim v'anoshim, which gladdens Hashem and men." Says, well, what do you mean it gladdens Hashem? Im anoshim mesameach, if wine surely is mesameach people, elokim v'amem mesameach, how is it mesameach Hashem? What does the gefen mean when he says he's being mesameach elokim? Mikan, from here we learn shein oyim shira ela al yain, that shira in the Beis Hamikdash is recited only upon the hakrava, the pouring of the yain, of the wine, Adam Mizbeach. So in conclusion, the Gemara is a kasha. You've suggested that the pasuk of Kodesh Hilulim, a plural Hilul, double praise, is referring to both brachos, prior and after eating food. How can you say that? It's not available. We need the drasha of Hilulim to teach us other halachas regarding Neter Ravai. Is coming to teach us, number one, that Chilul is required, redemption is required. That is learned from the first Hilul. The second Hilul is teaching you only something which brings about Shira during the Avodah, during the Karbanos, that has the din of Neter Ravai, which is grapes, which produces wine, which is Mesameach Elokim V'anoshim. Says the Gemara, Hanich leman detani Neter Ravai. Okay, this will work well according to the Shita that says Neter Ravai. Now, what the Gemara means is that there's a machlekes regarding the fourth year produce. These restrictions, these halachas of needing to bring it to Yerushalayim or redeeming it, is this said regarding all fruit from a tree, all produce that a tree brings forth in the fourth year, whether it's a vineyard, whether it's a different type of tree, or is this halacha merely restricted to a kerem, a vineyard? So we have a machlekes. Says the Gemara, okay, according to the Shita, that holds that the halacha applies to Neter Ravai, anything that's planted, Neter Ravai, anything that was planted, a sapling, anything that was planted and has now come to the fourth year. So according to this Shita, there is a pasuk available to teach you bracha. Why? Because the Hillel that we had used to teach you that it only applies, Neter Ravai only applies to vines which produce wine, which brings about shira. That is only according to the shita that holds kerem revai. But according to the shita that holds that the halacha of the fourth year applies to any type of tree, so then we don't need the hillel to teach you that, to teach you something to do with wine and shira, since this halacha applies to any type of tree. So we have one hillel available, and this will teach us bracha prior or after eating. Says the Gemara, again, okay, this works well. We will have a pasuk available for the requirement of bracha on food, according to the shita that says neta ravai, that the halacha of the fourth year applies to anything, any type of tree. According to the shita that holds that only applies to vineyards, and that is derived from one of the hillels to teach you something which brings about shira, which means a grapevine that contains the halacha of neta ravai. If so, both hillels are used. One is to teach you chilul, the redemption of the fourth year. One is to teach you kerem, that only the vine requires the halachas of the fourth year, and nothing is available to teach you the halacha of bracha. The Itmar, as we have learned this machlekes, Reb Chia, Shimon, Rebbe, there's machlekes between the two of them. Chad Tani kerem Ravai. One learns kerem Ravai whenever the Mishnah makes reference to the fourth year produce and the requirement to bring it to Yerushalayim. He's goyres kerem Ravai, a fourth year vineyard. The Chad Tani, and the other one learns neta Ravai, a fourth year sapling, a tree, any type of tree that produces fruit. Says the Gemara, okay, so according to the Manda Amar, neta Ravai, we're taken care of. We have a source for bracha. But according to the Manda Amar kerem Ravai, we're stuck because we have no pasuk available to teach you the chiyuv bracha. Says the Gemara, okay, but even according to that shita, perhaps we could come up with a solution. According to the shita that holds kerem Ravai, it would work well if he derives the halacha of kerem from Gzeira Shava. He'll connect a word in this context to a word in a different context and derive from there that the halacha of the fourth year applies to a kerem. And therefore, he will also have one pasuk of hillel available to teach you bracha, because he will learn the halacha of kerem from a different pasuk. It all works well if he learns it from Gzeira Shava. The Sani, as we have learned. Rebbe Omer Nemakan Loisel Lechem Tvosai. Here, meaning regarding the halacha of the fourth year, the pasuk uses the words Loisel Lechem Tvosai. This will earn you a reward that Hashem will increase your produce. V'nebel Tvos Hakerem, and elsewhere it uses the word Tvos Hakerem, meaning tvua, a produce next to the word kerem. So therefore, we learn Gzeira Shava as follows. We connect the two things: Malahal and kerem afkan kerem. Just like over there, tvua is used in the context of kerem, a vineyard. Here too, when it says lahoisel lechem tvuasai regarding the halachas of the fourth year, tvuasai is referring to a kerem, a vineyard. If so, we derive the halacha of vineyard from Gzeira Shava. And now, so we have one pasuk, one of these two hillels available to teach you the halacha of bracha. However, if he doesn't use this Gzeira Shava, he doesn't derive from this Gzeira Shava, bracha menala. If so, he needs to learn the halacha of kerem from Hillel. Again, Hillel is teaching you that something which brings about praise through Shira al Hayayin, that has the halachas of the fourth year. So he uses the pasuk for that. So he uses up both psukim. One pasuk to tell you Hillel, the requirement for redemption, and the other pasuk to tell you that the halacha is specific to kerem, and therefore there is no pasuk available to teach you bracha. Bracha manole. So back to the kasha. Says the Gemara, V'nami of Gzeira Shava. And granted, even if he will learn it from Gzeira Shava, and he will have one of the hillels available to teach you the chiyuv bracha, but that's only one hillel, one bracha. Ashchan la'achrav. Okay, so now you know that one bracha is required, and we assume this is the bracha following eating, as Rashi explains, as we find by Brachos HaMazayin, where the Torah tells you that you make a bracha after you finish your meal. So we have one pasuk that one is required to make a bracha after eating. However, lefanav manale, how would he know? How would he know that one is required to make a bracha lefanav manayin before eating? Says the Gemara, okay, halay kasha, this we can answer. The asab kavachaymer. We will derive from a reasoning with a kavachaymer. If he's required to make a bracha, once he's filled, once he's satiated, he has completed his eating experience, then he makes a bracha. Certainly, when he's hungry and he's desperate, he needs to come onto the food. Certainly at that point, lo koshkein, certainly he would be required to make a bracha, to acknowledge Hashem, to thank Him for giving him, for making the food available at his time of need. So we know both. Meaning once we have one hillel, once we found that one of the hillels is available to teach us, the chiyuv bracha la'achrav, so we will learn from there with a kal v'chomer that certainly before eating, one will make a bracha. Okay, says the Gemara, granted. So everything works out. According to the Man Amar, Neta Revai, that the halachas of the fourth year apply to all types of fruits. Certainly we have a pasuk available. One of the hillels, one of the two hillels, will come to teach us that there is a chiyuv bracha. You must praise Hashem when you eat. According to the Man Amar, Kerem Revai, that the halacha of the fourth year only applies to a vineyard. How we know that? We learn from Gzeira Shava that the halacha only applies to a vineyard, and therefore, according to him as well, one of the hillel will be available to teach us the chiyuv bracha. And as the Gemara concludes, it will teach us a bracha following eating. How we know a bracha prior to eating, that will be a kal v'chomer. Certainly, when one is desperate and needs the food, he should thank and praise Hashem upon making it available for him. Says the Gemara, okay, ashchan kerem. So now we have a raya that something which grows on a vine, even in grapes, require bracha. Since according to the Shita, let's remember, according to the Shita, kerem ravai, the pasuk of a kodesh hilul Hashem, you thank Hashem, you praise Him with a bracha, is referring to only a vineyard. So we found an obligation of a bracha by a kerem, something which grows in a vineyard. Sha'aminim minayim, what about other species, other types of food? Says the Gemara, di'alef mekerem, he will derive it from kerem. Ma kerem, just as kerem is davar shenene, something which he derives pleasure from. When he eats the grapes, v'ton bracha, and requires a bracha, afkol davar shenene, ton bracha. Therefore, everything else as well, something which provides him with physical pleasure, requires a bracha. So we derive it from kerem. Says the Gemara, no. Well, we could make a differentiation. We could make a distinction. We could refute this connection. Mala kerem shken chai ba'ilus. You know why a kerem requires a bracha? Because it has another advantage. It contains a halacha called oilulus. As Rashi explains, that the grapes that grow in a peculiar fashion and they're not bunched together. There are different details, different halachas, but the bottom line is that there's a certain mitzvah called oilus matnais aniyim, that the poor men are entitled to take away this type of grape and keep it for themselves. So we see that a vineyard has this unique mitzvah attached to it, and perhaps you can't learn from there. Regarding bracha, perhaps a vineyard is special. It contains the halacha of oilus, and so too it has the requirement of a bracha. Says the Gemara, we will refute this distinction by proving from kama. What is kama? Standing grain. We know that one is required to make a bracha when he eats bread. So that is a mitzvah in our Torah, to make a bracha on grain. Grain doesn't have the halacha of oilus. So that proves to us that a bracha is not contingent on oilus. Says the Gemara, Mala kama shein chayavas b'chala. Kama is not a proof. Perhaps kama is very different because it contains its own mitzvah, mitzvah's chala, to separate a part of the dough. So it has an advantage over all other produce. So we can't learn from kerem, because kerem has oilus. We can't learn from kama, from standing grain, because it has a chiyav chala. Says the Gemara, kerem yechiach. You can't attribute the obligation of a bracha to chala, because kerem will disprove it. In the kerem, there's no chiyav chala, and still there's a requirement for bracha. V'chazar adin, the argument will go back and forth without an end. Apparently, you can't attribute the chiyav bracha by a kerem on account of its chiyav oilus. You can't say it's contingent on oilus, because grain will prove that is not so. There's a chiyav bracha even without a chiyav oilus. On the other hand, you can't say that the chiyav bracha is contingent upon chiyav chala, because kerem doesn't have chiyav chala and still it's chayav bracha. So we see this nature is not like this nature, the nature of this one is not like that one. So what then is the basis for the obligation to make a bracha. Let's find a common characteristic between kerem and kama and grain. It is davar shenena v'torn bracha. It is something which provides a person with pleasure and requires a bracha, and therefore we will learn from there elsewhere as well. Af kol davar shenena torn bracha. Whenever a person has physical pleasure, he makes a bracha, and this is the source for all bracha obligations. So well, 1 second. Let's find something that distinguishes these two things, kerem and chala, kerem and kama, and thereby we cannot derive from there elsewhere. It says we find a common characteristic, a common denominator between a vineyard and grain. They have an element, an aspect of hakrava v'mizbeach. How is that? Wine coming from a kerem is poured on the mizbeach as a nesachim. Grain produces the flour for a mincha, which is also a korban. So that's why we make a bracha on them. And we can't derive from there to something that doesn't have a tzad mizbeach. Says more about asin amizayis. Okay, we can derive from there regarding an olive. This tzad mizbeach, because a olive also has an aspect of mizbeach, since the oil, which is pressed from an olive, gets brought onto the mizbeach. Okay, so we know these three. We know a vineyard, we know an olive, and we know grains. Says Gemara, 1 second. Why do you need to derive zayis with this type of limud, that the zayis has a tzad mizbeach, so therefore it's equated with the others? V'zayis mitzad mizbeach hasi. Is that the reason why a zayis will have a bracha? Habehed yiksiv be'kerem. We find the term kerem applied to zayis as well. Tiksiv vayirvar begodish v'atkama v'atkerem zayis. He burned from the godish, from the pile of grains, v'atkama, till the standing grain, at kerem zayis, until the kerem zayis. So we see that the term kerem can be applied to zayis as well. So without learning with the salashava, we can merely learn the obligation for a bracha by zayis from the fact that it is called a kerem, and therefore it has the same halachas of a vineyard. And just as a vineyard has a chiyuv bracha, as we had learned from Kodesh Hilulim Lashem, that according to the Shita, that it's referring to a kerem, a vineyard, it is required to make a bracha on it. Therefore, zayis as well, since the zayis is called a kerem, it too would require a bracha. Says Gemara, no, Amar Rav Papa, that is not a solution. Kerem zayis ikri, kerem stamale ikri. A zayis is called kerem zayis. We apply the term kerem, but only together with the word zayis. What type of kerem? A kerem zayis. But we never find kerem stamale ikri. Plain kerem is never applied to a zayis, and therefore we can't derive the obligation of a bracha for an olive from the concept of a chiyuv bracha by a kerem, which is ordinarily applied to a vineyard and not to an olive grove. Okay, so therefore we need to learn zayis from the fact that it has a tzad mizbeach, it has an element of hakrova, and therefore it can be equated with grapes and wine and grains, because they all three have a tzad mizbeach. They all three are connected somewhat to the mizbeach, and therefore they obligate a bracha. It says the Gemara, Mikol Makom Kasha, Mala tzad l'shavish ben shken yesh b'hem tzad mizbeach. Okay, so we're back to the question. All three things, whether it's yayin, whether it's grain, whether it's perhaps zayis, olives, all these three things have an element of mizbeach, and therefore they obligate a bracha. But how do you know regarding everything else? Ella says more, rather the yol from Meshivas Aminim. We will derive the chiyuv bracha for everything else from Meshivas Aminim, 7 special species, which the pasuk relates to them with the words v'achalta v'savata v'erachta, the chiyuv bracha, and therefore we learn from there to elsewhere. What's the derivation? Davar shenene v'tohan bracha, just like Shivas Aminim, mali Shivas Aminim davar shenene v'tohan bracha, just like those 7 minim are something that should provide pleasure to a person and they require bracha. Afkol, so to everything else. Davar shenena v'tohan bracha. If you have pleasure, physical pleasure, you make a bracha. Says the Gemara, there's a difference, there's a chiluk. Mala shivas haminim shkei chayam bebikurim. Shivas haminim are unique. They have an obligation of bikurim. The first fruits must be brought to the Beis Hamikdash. So perhaps only since they have that added element, that added obligation, they are unique, and therefore they have a chiyuv bracha when eaten, but not everything else. Says the Gemara, va'oid, another question. Hateinach la'achrav. Okay, so you have a source for a bracha. Which bracha? The pasuk, when the pasuk says v'achalta v'savalta v'rachta, speaking about after eating. So you have a source perhaps for a bracha after eating. Lefanav minayin, what about before eating? Says the Gemara, halei kasha. This is not a kasha. We'll use the same kavachayim mentioned earlier. Once you eat and you're satiated and you're full, then you're required to make a bracha. Certainly, of course, when you're hungry and you're desperate for the food, a bracha is required. Says the Gemara, okay, so we have a source for the bracha la'achra and the bracha lefanav. But what about the first kasha? We had a kasha. How can we learn from Shiva Saminim? Shiva Saminim is unique, since it has a chiv bikurim, and perhaps the bracha is contingent on that chiv. It is unique since it has a chiv bikurim. That's why it requires a bracha. But everything else that doesn't have a chiv bikurim will not require a bracha. So where is the source for a bracha for all other types of food? Perhaps we have a source for kerem, we have a source for grains, for zayis, for shiva saminim. But what about everything else? Says more. That's okay. That's one problem. Now leman the tani neta ravai. So this was a kasha according to the shita that held kerem ravai, that we know that a kerem is chayiv, has the halachas of the 4th year. Where do we know that from? From Exera Shava, Tvuas. That teaches us that the 4th year obligations only apply to a kerem. And that frees up one of the hills. We had a pasuk Kodesh Hilulim, a double expression of hilul. And one of those hills, it teaches us the chiyuv of chilul to redeem the fruit. The second hilul is available to teach us that a kerem is chayiv a bracha. When one eats the produce from a vineyard, he is mechayiv to make a bracha. Not only the produce from a kerem, the Gemara added kama, something which is a grain, that too requires a bracha. We learned that from V'chalta v'savata v'rachta. The Gemara added also something which is contained in an olive, since that too is learned with a tzad hashava, since all 3 things have a tzad mizbeach. The Gemara now added that shiva saminim as well are mechuyev bracha, since it says V'chalta v'savata v'rachta when the pasuk is speaking about shiva saminim. Okay, now what about the rest of the types of food? How do we know the source for bracha regarding them? Now the Gemara is going to ask another kash. What about the shita that held that the halachas of the 4th year apply not only to kerem but also to neta, anything, any tree, any sapling? So according to this shita, it was very simple. The source of a chiv bracha was very simple. It was from hilulim, since the pasuk tells us hilulim, 2 praises. One is telling you chilul, to redeem the fruit of the 4th year, and the second hilul, to praise Hashem, is telling you a chiyuv bracha for any type of food, because the pasuk was not referring to merely a kerem, merely something that grows in a vineyard. According to the shita of neta ravai, the pasuk was referring to any type of fruit. Says the Gemara, okay, but that will only be referring to something that's a sapling, a tree. This is all well regarding kaldavar natia, anything that is planted, the lavar natia, something which isn't planted, kigoin basar, beitzim v'dagim, meat, eggs, fish that are not planted. They're not a tree. They don't grow from the ground. So manoli, where will be the source for the chiv bracha on those items? So basically, we're stuck. Either way, we're stuck. According to the Manda Amar, kerem ravai, we're stuck because we only know a chiv bracha regarding specific things: a kerem, a zayis, grains, shiva saminim, but nothing else. According to the Manda Amar, neta ravai. So we have one of the psukim of Hillel is telling you a chiv bracha, a chiv to praise Hashem. But we only know neta, something which is planted. What about meat? What about eggs? What about fish? So we're stuck. Where is the source for a chiv bracha? Says the Gemara, Ella, rather, we must conclude that we know a chiv bracha from a svara. There's something of logic. Svarahu, asa loyla adam, sheyenem and oilam hazeh b'lei bracha. One can't partake. One can't derive physical pleasure from this world without giving a bracha. Says Rashi, without giving kivan the nana, says Rashi. Since he has pleasure, he needs to thank and acknowledge the one who created them. So it's a svara, it's a logic, it's common sense, and this is the source, this is the makar for chiv bracha. Ask Tosfos. If so why does the Gemara begin with a brisa, with the name of Rabbi Akiva, that asal adam sheyitum klum shekayim sheyivarach? we derive the Chiyav Bracha from the pasuk of Kodesh Hilul Hashem. The Gemara concludes that it's merely a svara. Says Tosfos, indeed it's a svara, but the pasuk of Kodesh Hilulim, one must praise Hashem prior to eating, prior and after eating. That is an asmachta. It is a basis. It is something to latch on. The Chachamim based their takana of bracha on that pasuk, even though the Chiyav Bracha is merely d'Rabbanan. Continues the Gemara. Ton Rabbanan. Indeed, Adam. A person can't derive physical pleasure from this world without a bracha. A person is nene without a bracha. He commits me'ilah. Me'ilah is an unauthorized use of hegdish property. One is taking something from Hashem without permission. My takante, what is the remedy? You should go to a wise man. Says the Gemara, what's the point of going to a chacham? My avidle, how could a chacham provide a remedy to one who has eaten food, who has been nene from the world without a bracha? Avidle Suri committed a transgression. Elam what he meant to say is as follows. Originally, initially, he should go to the chacham, Brachos, should teach him how to make brachos, specifically which brachos, on which types of food, so the person does not come to commit me'ilah. One who derives enough in this world without making a bracha, it is as though he had derived pleasure from hegdish. The world and its filled belongs to Hashem, and one who takes without permission, it's as though he took something from hegdish, something sanctified that is prohibited. Rav Levi Rami, he had a contradiction between two psukim. One pasuk says, "Ksiv Hashem ha'aretz u'maloya," the world belongs to Hashem. Uksiv, another pasuk says, "Hashemayim shemayim Hashem," only the heavens belongs to Hashem. But earth nasan la'yadam, down here on earth, Hashem granted it to us. So it seems to be a contradiction. Can one partake from this world or not? Does it belong to Hashem? Does it belong to us? Like kash, it's not difficult. Kan koydem bracha. Before one makes a bracha, it's shemayim Hashem. One may not take it. Kan, however, the pasuk that says that Hashem granted the things in this world to Bnei Adam is la'acha bracha. After one makes a bracha, he receives permission from Hashem and he's allowed to partake in the pleasures of this world. Amar Chanina bar Papa, kol hanenem na'um hazeh b'loi bracha, ki'ilu goizel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is like robbing Hashem Yisbarach, Knesset Yisrael, and the Jewish nation. Shneimar goizel v'imah, he robs Hashem, he robs his father and his mother. V'omer in pesha, I didn't commit anything. Chaver hu l'mishmashches, he's a friend to one who destroys. Explains Rashi, by refraining from making a bracha, and people notice your behavior, they too will refrain from making a bracha. And by doing so, they will incur a punishment, that their produce will become diminished, will falter, will suffer. So he's robbing Hashem of his bracha, number one. Number two, he's robbing Klal Yisrael of their blessings. Says Gemara, ve'in aviv el HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when the pasuk says, goizel av v'imai, aviv is Hashem, shnemar haloi hu avicha kanecha. Ve'in imai Knesset Yisrael, imai is Klal Yisrael, shnemar shema b'ni musar avicha, va'al tita ish Torah semecha, the Torah of your mother of Klal Yisrael. So what's the point of goizel? Why is a person's refraining from making a bracha equated with robbing from Hashem? So the explanation given is that when one makes a bracha, the point of a bracha, explains the Nefesh HaChaim, a point of a bracha is to bring down a blessing, to increase the flow of goodness from Hashem by recognizing that everything is sourced in Hashem's emanation, in Hashem's hashpah. By doing so, we are actually being marba, we're being moisif that hashpah. We're opening the channels, and we're, so to speak, allowing Hashem to provide for us dawas, to increase the hashpah. And Hashem wants to continue to do that, wants to do that continuously. So when a person does not make a bracha, he's blocking the channels. It's considered to be goiz l'HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's robbing Hashem, so to speak, of the opportunity to bestow us with goodness, with bracha. And in addition, he's also robbing Knesset Yisrael because he's limiting the blessings which are due to Klal Yisrael. Says the Gemara, "My chaver hu lishmashchus." What does it mean? He's a friend to the one who destroyed. Amar Papa chaver hu. He's a friend. He's a comrade. He's a colleague of the Yeravam ben Avat. Sheishchet es Yisrael avim sheshamayim, who destroyed Klal Yisrael's relationship with Hashem. Rav Chanina Papa Rami, he asked a contradiction between the following psukim. Ksiv, one pasuk says, "V'kachti d'gani bi'itay." Hashem says, "I will take away the grain from you," and then the other pasuk says, "Ksiv, v'asafta d'ganecha," you will harvest your grain. Like kasha, this is not difficult. Depends when. Kan bezman she'oisen Yisrael oisen tzon shel makom. When Klal Yisrael is fulfilling Hashem's will, then they will merit a blessing. They will harvest their produce. Kan, however, the first pasuk which threatens that Hashem will remove their dagan, their produce, bizman she'ein Yisrael oisen tzon shel makom, when we do not follow Hashem's will. Tanarban v'asafta d'ganecha, you should harvest your grains. Ma tamad leimar. What is the pasuk telling you? Levisha nemar. Because we find the pasuk tells you that one is meant to be immersed in Torah study at all times. The Sefer Torah should not depart from your mouth. You should be immersed and engaged in Torah study 24/7. Perhaps you can entertain that the pasuk is literal, that one is meant to be immersed in Torah study at all times without leaving yourself any time available to earn a livelihood. Talmud Leimer, the Torah comes to teach us, no, v'asafta d'ganecha, gather your harvest your produce. Haneg bohen minig derech eretz. You should conduct yourself with Torah together with derech eretz. You should earn a livelihood. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. This is the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, that one is meant to combine both aspects, Torah study and also to earn a livelihood, a parnasa. Rabbi Shimon Chai Omer, can't be so. Efshar, could you suggest? One will plow the time of plowing. Sows in the time of sowing. He harvests in the time of harvesting. He's busy. He threshes at the time of threshing. And winnows in the windy moments. If a person is preoccupied with earning a parnasa, livelihood, what will be with the Torah? You can't do both things at once. You can't properly immerse yourself in Torah if you are preoccupied with earning a parnasa, livelihood. Ella, rather, the solution is as follows. Bizman when Yidna on a very high madrega, they're tzaddikim gemurim. Their livelihood will be produced by others. Their malacha, their work will be provided by others. By goyim, shenama ba'amdu zorim, the zarim, referring to the goyim, they will pasture your flock. They will do your work for you, and this will allow us to be fully immersed exclusively in Torah study. However, when we're not on that high level, then we need to work and toil on our own. You will have to gather your grains. Not only that, if we are in a very low madrega and we are really not doing then we will need to even do other people's work. You will serve your enemies. As the Tosfos points out, that this Gemara seems to be a contradiction to the previous Gemara, which says that you will merit to harvest your grains, is referring to a time when the Yisrael are oisen Rishon Shel Makom. And here the Gemara says that is not so. When Yisrael oisen Rishon Shel Makom, they will not need to be involved in parnasa. The pasuk of Asafta D'Ganech is referring to when we're not oisen Rishon Shel Makom. Says Tosfos there are three levels. There is a level of when you're not really not following Hashem's will, and then will be punished. Hashem will remove the grains. The Gemara here says we'll have to serve our enemies. The level above that is when we will be oisen Rishon Shel Makom. We're on a high level, but not the highest level of tzaddikim gemurim. And therefore, at that point, we are required to make an effort for livelihood, to earn a parnasa. The highest level is tzaddikim gemurim, which don't even require any effort for parnasa. Melachta nas dayachirim, others will do their work for you. As the Gemara relates earlier, the Chasidim and Rishonim, they were immersed in davening for a great part of the day. Their Torah was retained within them. Their parnasa had a tremendous bracha. Parnasasam is Brachos. So it's a tzaddik gomer on a very high level. He merits a bracha that his parnasa is provided for him. Says the Gemara, Amar Abaye, we have a machlekes. How is one meant to approach the concept of parnasa, of sustenance? We have Rabbi Shmuel who says, combine the two things. Combine earning a livelihood together with learning Torah. We have Rabbi Shimon Chai says, no, that is incompatible. We're meant to immerse ourselves exclusively in Torah study, says Abaye. Experience shows the following. The masses, many followed the Rishmael's opinion. They combined scholarship with livelihood, and they were successful. Many tried Chai's route to immerse themselves exclusively in Torah study, and they were not successful. So apparently, as the Mepharshim speak out, for the masses, for the Hamoyin Am, for the community, one is meant to follow the advice of Rishmael, to combine scholarship with livelihood. For the Yechidim, for the individuals on a very high level, they may indeed follow the directive of Rav Shimon Yochai. Please, I beg you, the days of Nisan and Tishrei, which are, Nisan was a time of harvesting the grain, Yom Tishrei was a time of pressing the grapes and the olives. So the opportunity for earning a livelihood presents itself in those months. Please, don't show yourself before me, don't come to me. Earn a livelihood, earn your parnasa, don't give up the opportunity. Why? So that you'll not be preoccupied with earning a livelihood, the entire year. Set aside a set time to earn a parnasa when it presents itself during the Yom Nisan, the Yom Tishrei, so that you'll be free from the burden of parnasa the rest of the year, and you'll be able to learn with a free mind. Continues the Gemara. Let's take a look to contrast the early generations and their high level of righteousness with the standards in the later generations. The early generations conduct themselves differently, more righteous than the later generations. They made their Torah established, fixed. That was their main occupation. And their livelihood, their malacha, was secondary. They merited that both were retained. They were matzliach on both. They were successful on both. They attained scholarship and sustenance. However, they placed their main focus on their malacha, on earning a livelihood. Their learning was merely secondary. They were not successful, and none of them were successful. Come take a look at another difference. The early generations, they wanted to obligate themselves with Torah obligations, and therefore they would bring in their produce, their taxam in the normal way. We're talking about pears that were untied. The Torah Meiser would not remove yet. It's tevel. Now the halach is that even when it's finished, it's a finished product, it still needs to be brought in the regular way into the home, and then there's chayiv meiser. So they used to do that, is to bring it the regular way, and that would be mechayiv. They would obligate chayiv meiser. They wanted the chayiv. However, the latter generations, machnisen perisayim, derech gagos, they would do it in a way to absolve themselves from the chiyuv. They would bring it through the roofs, their chatzeres, their kafifas, through the storage places, they'll putchum and meiser, so that they are not obligated to do chiyuv meiser. As we see, the Rav Yanai, ein hatevel mischayiv meiser, produce is not obligated in meiser until it sees the doorway of the house, the front of the house. I remove the kodesh from the house. Apparently, it needs to be brought into the house first, prior to the chiyuv of tumas of meiser applying to it. Rav Yochanan, even a courtyard establishes a chiyuv tumas of meiser. You will eat in your courtyards, within your gates, meaning your courtyards, and you'll be satiated, referring to the chiyuv tumas of meisers, which applies even when the produce merely enters the courtyard. So in summary, the Gemara says, "Ein oisen ritzonei shel makom." When the Yidden don't fulfill Hashem's will, Hashem says, "Kach tidgani," I will remove the produce. When Yisrael oisen ritzonei shel makom, then Hashem says, "V'asafta deganecha," you will merit to gather and harvest your produce. Rav Shimon Yochai teaches us that tzaddikim gemurim, they merit that melachton nasa de'acherim, others provide for them, and this allows them to immerse themselves exclusively in Torah study. The Gemara relates that the Deresh Rishonim, the earlier righteous generations, also Torah and Kavah, the Torah was permanent, was primary, Umlachtan Arai, and their livelihood secondary, and they merited a blessing, a bracha, as a result. And finally, they would look to obligate themselves in the Chiv Tumas Maisis. They would be Machnes Perisein, their Traxim in the regular way, in order to obligate themselves in the Chiv of Tumas Maisis. Continues the Gemara, Chutz min hayayin. On fruit from a tree, we make boyer priyates, except for wine, which receives a special bracha, boyer priyagofen. Why? Why is wine different? Ilema, you're going to say, Mishum de Ishtane Leluya, since it was changed for the better. Ishtane lebracha, therefore it merits its own bracha. Very Shemin, regarding oil, we find, although the Ishtane Leluya, even though it was changed for the better, it became from an olive into oil. However, its bracha doesn't change. The Amar Rav Amar Shmuel, the Chen Rav Yitzchak Rav Yochanan, Shemen Zayis, olive oil, mevarach on love by creates. So we see that it retains its original bracha, even though it changes for the better. Amri, the Gemara says as follows. They said, Hasam, over there by olive oil, Mishum Dalai Efshar, we have no alternative, we have no other option. Heiche Nivrich, what kind of bracha should we make? Nivrich by Priya Zayis? We should say Hashem creates the fruit of the zayis, the produce of the zayis. Perugufe zayis ikri. The fruit itself, the olive itself, is called zayis. And when we make a bracha that Hashem creates the fruit of the zayis, the produce of the zayis, meaning the oil coming from the zayis, the fruit, that is not correct. Because who extracts the oil? That is done by man. So this bracha is not an accurate bracha. Says the Gemara of Nivra Chalei, Boyer Priyat Zayis. Okay, we can't say Boyer Priyat Zayis. Let us say Boyer Priyat Zayis. Hashem creates the fruit from the olive tree, and that is an accurate bracha. Ella rather, says the Gemara, what is the reason why wine is different than oil? Amar Mazutra Chamra Zayin, wine has the power to sustain, to satiate. Mishcha, oil, however, Loy Zayin doesn't satiate. Says the Gemara, Mishcha Loy Zayin, is that true that oil doesn't satiate? We find that Mishnah teaches us otherwise, that even oil has the power to satiate. Vatnan, Hanoidim min hamazon, one who vows to refrain from mazon, he's not allowed to eat anything, all types of food except mutar b'mayim v'melach. He's allowed to drink water and eat salt. We ask the following question: Mayim v'melach adol ikru mazon. Apparently, water and salt is not included in the term mazon. This person made a vow to refrain from mazon, from sustenance. He can't eat anything. Everything is called mazon, except for these two items. Apparently everything else is considered to be mazon, sustenance. And this is a direct contradiction to Rav and Shmuel. Name it Rav Shmuel, perhaps this is a refutation to Rav and Shmuel. The Amri who say as follows: Ein mevarchin boyer mina mezonis. The bracha of boyer Hashem creates mina mezonis, the species of sustenance, is only said ela behi amina milvad, the 5 types of grain: wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. They are considered to be mazon and nothing else. So how do we understand this Mishnah which prohibits one who says, I will refrain from mazon? He's not allowed to partake in any food. How does this work with Rav Shmuel, who said that mazon is only referring to the 5 grains? This person who made a nether, he didn't say, I'm refraining from mazon. He's refraining from kol hazon alai, anything that has the power to sustain. True, mazon, the true power of sustenance, is only given to the 5 grains. However, everything else has a bit of an ability to sustain a person, satiate a person somewhat. Therefore, when one says, I will refrain from anything that's kol hazon, anything that sustains, that includes all foods except for mayim and melech, which don't even have that ability. Alma, okay, so let's conclude. Apparently, mishcha zayin, oil as well has the power to sustain. It is included in this person's nether. So we see here that just like wine has the power to sustain, oil does as well. So why do you differentiate between the two? Wine requires its own bracha and oil doesn't. Says Gemara, Ella, we will have another reason. Chamr soit. Chamr wine has the power to satiate, to satisfy, which is a greater level of sustenance than merely zon. Mishchal soit, oil doesn't have that power. Says the Gemara, v'chamra b'soid, how can you say that wine fills and satiates? V'rava have a shasi chamra. Rava, his practice was to drink wine. Kol mal yomer the pischa on erev Pesach. Why? Ki'echad the niger libei, to whet his appetite. V'neichel matzah tvei, and this will bring him to eat a matzah, a lot, matzah with a lot of appetite, which is a hidur mitzvah. So apparently, drinking wine doesn't satiate, actually whets the appetite. Says the Gemara, yes, tuvagar, a lot of wine whets the appetite. Portasoid, a bit of wine satiates the person. So again, the difference between wine and oil, a bit of wine satiates, but oil doesn't satiate. If a wine requires its own unique bracha, and oil doesn't. Says the Gemara, Misoid Klal, how can you say that wine satiates? Wine will be misameach, glad in the heart of a person. Bread is sayed, bread satiates. Apparently wine doesn't. Says the Gemara, Nahama hu desoid, Chamer lo soid. Nahama bread satiates, but Chamer wine doesn't. Says the Gemara, El Chamer isbei tarti. True, wine has both elements. Soid u'mesameach. It satiates and it gladdens. Nahama bread is only unique by the fact that it's miset soid, it satiates, but sumuchi lo mesameach. It doesn't enliven, it doesn't make a person happy, it doesn't gladden. So this is what the pasuk means. Lechem is levavenish isa, it satiates. It's not mesameach, it doesn't gladden. Wine has both elements. It satiates and it gladdens. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, that wine satiates, so why don't we make a full-fledged Brachos HaMazayin on wine? Since it's considered to be a meal, it satiates. Says the Gemara, nevertheless, like kavi inshi to das salivate. People don't establish a meal around wine. Therefore, it is not considered to be a bona fide meal like bread. If one decides, yes, to establish a meal around his wine, does it require Brachos HaMazayin? He says, when Eliyahu Navi will come, he will tell us, if this is considered to be an established meal, if it has the status of a Sudas Kavua. Hashta, in the meantime, Mia Batladaitis Kaladam. This is not the normal way of a person's mode of behavior, meaning this person's das, this person's mindset is batladaitis, it's nullified according to the accepted norms amongst the regular population. Therefore, if this person is unique in the fact that he establishes a meal around his wine, it's not considered to be a sudas kavua, but rather it is merely drinking wine, and it doesn't require Brachos HaMazayin. So in summary, the Gemara says if one makes a neder, kol hazon alai, anything that sustains, I will refrain from that. He's prohibited to partake in any type of food because everything has the power to sustain somewhat, except for mayim and melach. Regarding the term mazayin, sustenance, that term is applied only to the chameshes minei dogan, to the 5 grains, and therefore they require a bracha, a ber minei mizaynos. Regarding lechem, bread, that is soyed, that satiates one person. One establishes a meal, he's kaveh suda around his bread, and therefore that requires a Brachos HaMazayin. Regarding wine, it too requires a unique bracha, a very priagefen, on account of the fact that it too is soyed, it satiates. As the Gemara said, a bit of wine satiates a lot, whets the appetite. However, regarding Brachos HaMazayin, that is not set upon wine, since generally we don't establish a meal around wine. If one decides to do so, we say batla date to kaladam. His mind becomes nullified regard to the norm and accepted in our society, unless Eliyahu Navi will come and tell us otherwise.